There was a town where children walked 4 kilometers every morning to reach a school that had no roof, where rain turned classrooms into muddy pools and teachers held lessons under plastic tarps that flapped in the wind like flags of surrender. The federal budget of 2012 allocated 2 million Rs for the construction of 3 classrooms, a library and sanitation facilities that would serve 217 students in a municipality so small it appeared on maps only as a dot without a name. The funds were approved by the Ministry of Education, signed by federal controllers, transferred through official banking channels, recorded in public spreadsheets that anyone with internet access could verify, and yet the children still sat on broken chairs under that same torn plastic 5 years later. In the audit report numbered 047/2017, federal inspectors documented that the construction never began, that no contractor was ever seen in the town, that the land designated for the new school remained empty except for wildflowers and rusting wire fences. The money had arrived in the municipal account on March 14th at 9:32 in the morning. A transfer confirmed by Banco do Brasil with all the formal precision that government transactions require, and then it simply dissolved into a silence that no one could or would explain. There were families in that town who believed for years that the delay was temporary, that the machines would arrive next month, that bureaucracy moved slowly but always arrived eventually, because they had been shown the official documents, the stamps, the signatures of people whose names carried authority. A mother named Clarice told investigators that she had seen the project announcement posted on the wall of the municipal office, that she had copied the reference number into a notebook she kept beside her Bible, and that she checked that number on the transparency portal every week, watching the status remain frozen in a category called In Progress, while her daughter grew too old for elementary school. The Congressional Investigative Commission of 2018 examined 43 similar cases across 7 states, towns where federal health posts were funded but never built, where water treatment systems existed only as architectural drawings in filing cabinets, where ambulances purchased with federal grants were never delivered. In one municipality of 4,000 souls, the Ministry of Health had allocated 1.3 million Rs for a basic health unit that would serve families who traveled 3 hours by unpaved road to reach the nearest doctor, women who gave birth in homes without electricity, children who died from diseases that vaccines could have prevented. The official contract was signed, the construction company registered, the project timeline submitted and approved by federal agencies, but when auditors visited the site 7 years later, they found only an empty field where cows grazed and a single wooden sign, weathered and illegible, that might once have announced something that mattered. The investigative report described the absence with clinical precision. No foundation had been poured, no materials delivered, no workers employed, no evidence that anyone had ever intended to transform that plot of dirt into a place where human suffering might be reduced. And still the municipal government submitted progress reports every quarter, documents that described construction phases that never occurred, percentages of completion for walls that were never raised, invoices for cement that was never mixed, a paper trail of fiction maintained with bureaucratic diligence, while real people continued to die from preventable causes. There was a town called Lagoa dos Esquecidos, where the water came from a contaminated well, where children suffered chronic diarrhea, where the elderly developed kidney stones from drinking liquid that tasted of minerals and decay, and where hope arrived in the form of a federal sanitation project approved in 2014. The project promised a modern water treatment facility, distribution pipes that would reach every home, an end to the diseases that had plagued generations, and the budget allocated was 4.7 million Rs, a sum so large that people whispered it with reverence, as if saying the number too loudly might cause it to vanish. The mayor at that time held a public ceremony where he displayed enlarged printouts of the federal approval documents, where he promised that within 18 months, every family would turn on a tap and receive water clean enough to drink without fear. And the crowd applauded because they believed institutions kept their promises. But 18 months became 3 years, and 3 years became 7, and the water treatment facility remained a ghost, a phantom infrastructure that lived only in municipal reports submitted to federal databases that no one appeared to read. When the public ministry finally investigated in 2021, they discovered that the construction company listed in the contract had no employees, no equipment, no history of completing any project anywhere, and an address that led to an abandoned storefront in a city 400 kilometers away. The federal funds had been transferred, received, and then moved through a series of accounts whose ownership was obscured by shell companies and nominee directors, a financial labyrinth designed not to build anything, but to hide everything. And by the time prosecutors traced the final destinations, the statute of limitations had expired for many of the offenses. The audit court's final report used language so technical and emotionally distant that it transformed human tragedy into accounting discrepancies, failures of oversight, irregularities in procurement processes, as if the real crime was paperwork, rather than the children who continued to drink poisoned water while bureaucrats debated jurisdictional boundaries. If you're watching this and you recognize the silence, the waiting, the promises documented and forgotten, consider staying with us, subscribing to this channel. Because these stories need witnesses. They need people who refuse to let institutional amnesia erase what happened. And perhaps together we can make silence a little less comfortable for those who rely on our forgetting. There were towns where federal money arrived for ambulances that would never transport a single patient, for medical equipment that was never unpacked from crates that were never shipped, for salaries of doctors who were never hired to work in clinics that were never opened. In one investigation spanning 5 years, auditors documented that 73 municipalities had received health infrastructure funding totaling over 100 million reais, and in 41 of those towns, not a single project reached completion. Not a single announced benefit materialized into something a sick person could touch or use. The pattern was always similar. Funds transferred from Brasilia with all proper authorization, initial reports submitted describing early construction phases, then a gradual silence, a cessation of updates, and finally, years later, an audit revealing nothing but empty lots and forged documentation. What made these cases particularly devastating was not just the theft, though theft it certainly was, but the institutional architecture that allowed it to continue, the layers of oversight that somehow never saw, the reporting requirements that were met with fiction, the federal agencies that accepted municipal lies because questioning them would require effort, resources, and an admission that the system itself was failing. The children who walked to the roofless school grew into teenagers who dropped out because learning under plastic tarps in the rain felt like a mockery of education, and they joined the ranks of young people without prospects, without skills, without belief that institutions existed to serve them, rather than exploit their distance and powerlessness. The families in Lagoa dos Esquecidos continued to boil water that boiling could not purify, continued to watch their children sicken, continued to bury their elderly years before poverty and contamination should have claimed them, and they did this while knowing that money specifically allocated to save them had been stolen in ways so sophisticated that prosecution became nearly impossible. The Congressional Commission's final report, published in December 2019, ran to 3,400 pages, named dozens of municipalities, detailed hundreds of missing projects, calculated billions in diverted funds, and recommended criminal prosecutions that mostly never occurred because evidence had degraded, witnesses had disappeared, and the political will to pursue justice evaporated as new scandals captured attention. One investigator, speaking off the record to journalists, said that the hardest part was not uncovering the fraud, which was often obvious, but explaining to people in Brasilia why they should care about towns they had never heard of, people they would never meet, children whose faces would never appear on television. The infrastructure that never materialized represented more than concrete and pipes. It represented a promise that government could see beyond the capital, that federal solidarity meant something tangible, that distance from power did not equal invisibility, and when that promise was revealed as performance, as theater, something fundamental broke in the relationship between citizen and state. There were mothers who kept those reference numbers copied into notebooks, who continued checking transparency portals even after years of no updates, who maintained a faith in documentation that seemed almost religious, as if the right combination of numbers and letters might summon justice from indifferent systems. The courts processed cases with the speed of erosion, years passing between charges and trials, trials and appeals, appeals and final judgments that often concluded that while irregularities had occurred, criminal intent could not be sufficiently proven to satisfy the burden of evidence required for conviction. Meanwhile, the statute of limitations ticked forward with perfect mechanical reliability, converting crimes into history, transforming accountability into academic discussion, ensuring that by the time legal systems finished deliberating, the urgency had faded and the victims had grown too tired to demand anything except acknowledgement. In 2022, a federal audit identified that across 12 states, over 200 infrastructure projects funded between 2010 and 2016 had never been completed, existed only as entries in government databases, phantoms of development that haunted budget spreadsheets but never touched earth. The total value of these phantom projects exceeded 3 billion reais, money that could have built hospitals, schools, water systems, roads that connected isolated communities to markets and emergency services, but instead simply disappeared into a network of accounts and intermediaries designed for precisely this purpose. What the audits could measure was financial. What they struggled to quantify was the cumulative weight of betrayal, the psychological cost of learning that your government had approved your salvation and then stolen it, that the institutions you were taught to trust operated with predatory indifference to your survival. The teachers who taught under plastic tarps eventually stopped teaching. The health workers who traveled impossible distances eventually stopped traveling. The community leaders who organized meetings to demand answers eventually stopped organizing because institutional silence is not passive. It is an active weapon that exhausts opposition through sheer immovable mass. There was a specific cruelty in the fact that these projects were not secretly cancelled. They remained officially in progress for years, listed on transparency websites, included in municipal reports, cited in political speeches, maintained as evidence of governmental action, while the people supposedly being served continued to suffer the absence of everything that had been promised. The investigation revealed that in some cases, municipal officials submitted photographs of construction in other towns, in other states, claiming them as evidence of local progress, a deception so brazen it suggested they believed no one was watching, no one would check, no one with power cared enough to verify. And they were largely correct in that belief, because the verification that eventually came arrived years too late to prevent the harm, to recover the funds, to punish the responsible, arriving only in time to document what had been lost and to recommend systematic changes that subsequent administrations would ignore. The children who needed the school, the families who needed clean water, the sick who needed the health post, they could not wait for systematic changes. They needed intervention in real time. They needed someone to notice when the construction did not begin, when the contractor never appeared, when the quarterly reports described fictional progress. But the oversight systems were designed for scale, for processing thousands of projects across a continental nation. And in that scale, the individual town became invisible, its suffering a rounding error, its betrayal a marginal case not worth the resources required to investigate in real time. So time passed, which is what institutions count on, time that turns outrage into exhaustion, evidence into fading memory, victims into statistics that no longer demand justice, but merely documentation. The Congressional Commission concluded its work, published its recommendations, held press conferences that generated one news cycle of attention and then dissolved as commissions do, its members returning to other priorities, while the towns they had investigated continued to exist without the infrastructure they had been promised. In Lagoa dos Esquecidos, the contaminated well still serves families who have learned to accept stomach pain as normal, who no longer imagine that government might intervene, who tell their children that the water treatment plant was just a story adults told when they still believed stories, a fairy tale of federal care that never quite came true. The school with no roof was eventually condemned as unsafe, and the children now travel 8 kilometers to another municipality's school, waking before dawn, returning after dark, losing hours to a commute necessitated by infrastructure that was funded but never built. The audit reports gather dust in archives, available to any citizen curious enough to search, detailed enough to understand exactly what was stolen and from whom, precise enough to calculate the cost in reais, but silent on the cost in dignity, in hope, in the foundational belief that you matter to the nation you belong to. These were not natural disasters, not accidents of mismanagement, but deliberate constructions of absence, sophisticated systems designed to extract resources while producing documents that simulated care, a performance of governance that fooled oversight long enough for accountability to become impossible. And perhaps the deepest wound was not the theft itself, but the revelation it forced, the knowledge that distance made you vulnerable, that your town's size made it disposable, that the infrastructure of care was conditional on visibility, on political utility, on metrics that did not include your children's education or your family's health. The people in these towns were not asking for charity. They were asking for what had already been approved, allocated, transferred, promised through official channels with official signatures. They were simply asking that promises documented become promises kept. But between documentation and reality lay an abyss where money vanished, where contractors evaporated, where municipal officials shrugged and federal agencies looked away, where the machinery of state proved unable or unwilling to complete the simple task of building what it had committed to build. The towns remain, the families endure, the children grow up learning that official promises are a language spoken by people who do not expect to be held accountable, and this education in institutional betrayal becomes inheritance, passed from generation to generation like trauma, like defeat. There is a question that the audit reports never asked, that the Congressional Commission avoided, that hovers over all these documented failures. What happens to a democracy when entire communities learn through experience that they do not matter, that their needs documented and approved will still be ignored? That distance from power equals abandonment? The answer is being written now in towns whose names most Brazilians have never heard, in communities that have learned not to believe, not to hope, not to expect that the next announced project will be different from all the previous phantoms. The money allocated for their salvation funded something, just not schools or water or health. Perhaps it funded the cynicism that now defines their relationship with every level of government, the hard knowledge that they are visible only when their votes are needed, and invisible when their infrastructure fails. And so they wait, not for construction that will come, but for the next announcement, the next ceremony, the next municipal leader who will display federal documents and promise transformation. And they will listen politely because politeness costs nothing, and they will not believe because belief has proven expensive. The reports are public, the numbers documented, the pattern undeniable for anyone willing to see. And yet the response from institutions has been primarily rhetorical. New oversight mechanisms proposed, new reporting requirements mandated, new layers of bureaucracy added to systems that already failed because people chose to fail them, not because the procedures were insufficient. Tell us, have you seen this silence in your town, in your state, in the places where federal promises arrived with fanfare and disappeared without explanation, where the approved became the abandoned, where documentation replaced delivery, where your community learned that it was small enough to forget? Leave your story below because these silences multiply in isolation but lose power when named collectively. When we recognize that what happened in Lagoa dos Esquecidos happened in 100 towns, 1,000 towns, that institutional abandonment was not an accident, but a pattern, not an exception, but a method.